When I first began my journey of learning English, it felt as if I was standing at the base of a giant mountain. The peak was covered in clouds and I could not see the top, but I knew I wanted to climb it. Every step seemed uncertain and heavy because everything about the language felt so new and unfamiliar. I remember opening a textbook and seeing pages full of strange grammar rules that looked more like puzzles than sentences. The words themselves felt foreign, like they belonged to another world. On top of that, whenever I tried to listen to native speakers, their voices sounded impossibly fast. Their words seemed to blend together, and I could not separate one sound from the next. At that time, I wondered how anyone could ever reach the point of understanding and speaking with confidence. One of the hardest feelings in those early days was the fear of making mistakes. I often stayed quiet during lessons or group conversations because I was worried that people would laugh at me. Even when I knew the answer to a question, my hand hesitated in the air because I did not trust myself to say it correctly. Each time I spoke, my heart would beat faster, and my mind would race ahead, imagining the mistakes I might make. That fear created confusion and sometimes even embarrassment. But looking back now, I realize that these feelings were not a sign of weakness. They were simply a natural part of learning, and almost every person who learns English goes through the same stage. I can still recall the first time I tried to speak with a native speaker. I had memorized a few sentences the night before, practicing them again and again until they sounded smooth in my head. But when the moment arrived, I froze. The words that had seemed so clear just hours earlier slipped away like water through my fingers. The native speaker smiled patiently, waiting for me to continue, and I managed to say something broken but understandable. It was not perfect, but it was communication. And that small success gave me the courage to keep trying. Over time, I learned that the fear of mistakes was not something to escape from but something to embrace. Every error I made was actually a teacher in disguise. For example, once I said I go to school yesterday, and a friend gently corrected me with I went to school yesterday. At first, I felt embarrassed, but later I realized that I remembered that correction far more deeply than any grammar rule I had memorized from a book. Slowly, I began to see mistakes as stepping stones instead of obstacles. Each one moved me a little closer to the top of the mountain. Another challenge I faced early on was the overwhelming amount of vocabulary. I believed that I needed to know every single word in the dictionary in order to speak well. So I spent hours writing down long lists of new words and trying to memorize them. Sometimes I even set myself goals like 50 new words in one night. But by the next day, most of them had disappeared from my memory. This method left me tired, frustrated, and feeling like a failure. It was only later that I realized learning words is not about memorizing lists, but about meeting those words again and again in real contexts. Reading a story or listening to a podcast allowed me to see how words lived inside sentences, and that made them easier to remember. Listening was also a mountain of its own. In the beginning, everything sounded too quick. It was like listening to music in a language I did not understand. At first, I tried to catch every single word, which made me frustrated. Eventually, I discovered that listening is more about training the ear than about perfection. I started with short videos and podcasts that were simple and slow. I repeated them many times, often with subtitles, until the sounds became familiar. Over weeks and months, my ears adjusted. I started to catch not just words but also rhythm and tone. Little by little, English began to sound less like noise and more like a language I could join. Even though the mountain looked impossible at the beginning, I realized that small steps every day made a difference. Speaking with a friend for 5 minutes, writing a short diary entry, or listening to a podcast during my walk to school slowly built my confidence. These habits created a sense of consistency. The mountain did not shrink, but I grew stronger. The fear that once stopped me began to fade, replaced by the understanding that mistakes and confusion are not enemies. They are part of the climb. Now, when I look back at those first days of struggle, I no longer see them as failures. I see them as the foundation of my learning. Every hesitation, every mistake, Every moment of confusion played an important role in shaping my path. Learning English may have started as a frightening challenge, but step by step, it turned into one of the most rewarding journeys of my life. When I first started learning English, I thought I knew the secret to success. I believed that the only way to master the language was to fill notebooks with grammar rules and endless vocabulary lists. Every day after school, I sat at my desk with a heavy grammar book, trying to understand complicated explanations and memorizing rules that never seemed to end. I copied irregular verbs again and again, hoping that repetition alone would make them stick in my mind. Alongside this, I wrote page after page of new words, convinced that if I collected enough vocabulary, one day I would magically become fluent. At first, I felt proud of my effort. My notebooks looked full, and the pages were covered with carefully written lists. I thought this was proof that I was making progress. But when the moment came to actually use English, all those rules and words seemed to disappear. In conversation, I froze. I could not recall the right verb form, and the words I had memorized the night before were nowhere in my mind. It was as if I had stored them in a locked box that I could not open when I needed it most. This method quickly began to feel exhausting. Sitting for hours trying to force my brain to remember long lists drained my energy and motivation. Sometimes I would spend an entire evening memorizing 50 words, only to realize the next morning that I had forgotten most of them. Other times, I would read grammar explanations so complex that I could not even understand them in my native language, let alone apply them in English. The more I pushed myself with this approach, the more discouraged I felt. Instead of becoming more confident, I was growing more frustrated. I realized something important during that period. Learning a language is not the same as memorizing facts for an exam. With school subjects like history or science, memorization might help you pass a test. But with a language, memorization without practice is almost useless. English is alive. It lives in conversations, in stories, in songs, and in everyday expressions. I was treating it as if it were a list of formulas to be memorized, and that was my biggest mistake. There was one evening that I remember clearly. I had been trying to memorize a long list of irregular verbs. I repeated them out loud. Begin, began, begun, break, broke, broken, choose, chose, chosen. I said them over and over, almost like chanting. Hours later, I felt confident that I knew them well. But the very next day in class, I wanted to say that I had chosen the red book. Instead, I froze. The word refused to come. That was the moment I realized my method was not working. Memorizing words in isolation was like collecting puzzle pieces but never trying to put them together. Slowly, I started to see why this approach was so tiring and ineffective. Language is not built from separate parts but from connections. Words are meaningful when they appear in context, and grammar rules make sense when they are used in real sentences. By focusing only on memorization, I was missing the most important part: the experience of using the language in real life. This mistake is common among learners, and I think it happens because memorization feels safe. It gives the illusion of progress. Writing down 20 new words looks like achievement. Finishing a chapter of grammar rules feels like a step forward. But when the time comes to speak, listen, or write, reality shows the truth. Without practice, those words and rules remain locked away, useless in real situations. I remember how boring it became after a while. I would stare at the same pages every day, trying to force my brain to remember something it did not want to keep. Sometimes I even started to dislike English because I associated it with that tired, repetitive routine. It felt more like punishment than learning. The joy of discovering a new language was hidden under piles of lists and rules. Looking back now, I can see how much time I wasted. But at the same time, I also understand that making mistakes is part of the journey. That stage taught me something valuable. Memorization alone will never bring fluency. Language needs to be lived, not just studied. Eventually, I began to change my approach. Instead of writing lists of 50 words, I chose to read short stories or articles where words appeared naturally. Instead of memorizing grammar explanations, I practiced building simple sentences and learned from my errors. When I encountered a new word in a story, it stuck in my mind because it was part of a picture, a situation, a feeling. That connection made it easier to remember. The more I moved away from pure memorization, the more progress I made. My motivation returned because learning started to feel alive again. English was no longer just lines on a page, but something I could use to express myself, to connect with others, and to understand the world in a new way. Today, I can look back and smile at my early mistakes. Filling notebooks with rules and vocabulary lists may not have made me fluent, but it was a necessary step in my journey. It showed me what does not work, and that lesson was just as important as discovering what does. Learning English taught me that the path to fluency is not about collecting words like trophies, but about using them in real life, every single day. When I finally grew tired of memorizing endless lists and grammar rules, I asked myself a serious question. What if I was approaching English the wrong way from the very beginning? For so long I had treated English like a subject to pass in school rather than a skill to use in real life. That realization was the turning point. I understood that if I wanted to truly improve, I needed to build all 4 core skills: reading, listening, speaking, and writing. It was not enough to focus on only one part while ignoring the others. A language is like a table with 4 legs, and without balance, it will always collapse. I started with reading, because books and stories had always been my comfort zone. At first, I was afraid that my vocabulary would not be strong enough to understand anything outside of textbooks. But instead of trying to look up every single word, I allowed myself to read for the general idea. Short articles, children's stories, and online posts became my practice material. Whenever I saw a new word, I paid attention to the sentence around it. Slowly, I realized that words made sense in context. For example, I learned that the phrase "take a break" was not about physically taking something but about resting. Expressions that once looked strange began to feel natural because I saw them again and again in different situations. Reading in this way did not just teach me words, it also opened the door to natural patterns of expression that no vocabulary list could ever provide. Alongside reading, I turned my focus to listening. This was perhaps the most challenging part at the beginning. Native speakers sounded incredibly fast, as if their words blended into one long sound. At first, I could only catch a few familiar phrases while the rest was a blur. But I did not give up. I began with podcasts made for learners, then slowly moved on to real interviews, songs, and YouTube videos. Subtitles became my best friend. I watched movies and matched the sounds with the words on the screen. Over time, my ears adjusted. I started to notice intonation, rhythm, and the way certain words connected in natural speech. Listening was not just about understanding the message, it was also training my brain to hear the music of the language. That music began to stick with me, and soon I could recognize expressions even without subtitles. Speaking, however, was the skill that terrified me the most. I knew I could read and listen quietly by myself, but speaking meant stepping into the open, making mistakes, and risking embarrassment. At first, my voice would shake whenever I tried to say even a short sentence. But I reminded myself that fluency could never grow in silence. I had to speak even if every sentence was filled with errors. I started small, greeting tourists in my city with a simple hello or asking where they came from. Their smiles encouraged me more than any grammar book ever could. Then I joined online groups where learners from around the world practiced together. The first time I introduced myself in English, I felt nervous, but people were kind. They did not laugh at my mistakes. Instead, they asked me questions, and I discovered that communication was possible even without perfection. Every conversation added a layer of confidence. I realized that speaking is the fastest way to build courage. Mistakes no longer scared me because each one was a lesson disguised as failure. Finally, I turned to writing. At first, it seemed slower than the other skills, but I soon discovered its power. Writing gave me the space to think carefully about my words. When I spoke, I had to react quickly, but in writing I could pause, check my grammar, and search for better expressions. I began with short journal entries about my daily life. Even describing what I ate for breakfast or how I felt after school helped me practice forming sentences. Later, I challenged myself with longer texts, such as emails, short essays, or even stories. Through writing, I could see my progress more clearly. Mistakes stood out on paper, but so did improvements. Over time, my writing became not only a tool for practice but also a way to express my thoughts in a new language. Balancing these four skills completely changed my learning experience. Reading gave me vocabulary and natural phrases. Listening trained my ears and helped me understand how the language truly sounded. Speaking built my confidence and reminded me that communication is more important than perfection. Writing slowed me down in the best way, allowing me to organize my thoughts and use grammar with care. Together, they formed a system that supported itself. The more I read, the easier listening became. The more I listened, the more natural my speaking sounded. The more I spoke, the easier it was to write my ideas. Looking back, I can see how different this approach is from the way I first studied English. Instead of struggling with isolated lists and rules, I now learn through experience and use. Every skill adds to the others, and every day brings a chance to practice. English is no longer something trapped in textbooks. It has become a living part of my daily routine, a bridge that connects me to stories, voices, and people around the world. When I first began learning English, I was terrified of making mistakes. Every time I opened my mouth, I worried about saying the wrong word, using the wrong tense, or pronouncing something incorrectly. I imagined people laughing at me or shaking their heads in confusion. Because of that fear, I often stayed silent. I thought it was safer not to speak at all than to risk embarrassing myself. What I did not realize at the time was that my silence was holding me back more than any mistake ever could. Over time, I discovered that mistakes were not the enemy I thought they were. In fact, they became my greatest teachers. The first time I spoke to a foreign tourist in my city, I mixed up simple words. I wanted to say nice weather, but instead I said good climate. The tourist smiled kindly and repeated my sentence with the correct phrase. That moment stayed with me. It was not painful, it was not humiliating. It was simply a small correction that taught me something new. From then on, I never forgot the phrase nice weather. It became clear to me that mistakes are like signposts on the road, showing me where I need to grow. The more I practiced, the more mistakes I made. At first it felt overwhelming. Every conversation seemed to reveal another weakness. But then I noticed something important. With each error, I remembered the right form more clearly. When I used the wrong verb tense, someone corrected me, and the correction stuck in my memory much longer than any grammar exercise from a textbook. Mistakes had a way of burning lessons into my mind in a way that success never did. Success felt good, but mistakes made me learn. One of the hardest lessons for me was pronunciation. I struggled with certain sounds that did not exist in my native language. I remember trying to say the word beach, but it came out sounding like another word that made people laugh. For a moment I felt embarrassed and wanted to give up, but instead I went home and practiced. I repeated the sound again and again, listening to recordings and copying them. A week later I tried again, and this time people understood me perfectly. If I had not made the mistake, I would never have realized how important that sound was. The mistake became my motivation to improve. I also made plenty of mistakes in writing. In my journal, I often used the wrong prepositions or left out small words. When I shared my writing with friends online, they pointed out the errors. At first, it felt discouraging to see so many red marks. But then I noticed that the more corrections I received, the fewer mistakes I made the next time. Writing slowly taught me patience and accuracy. Each error I corrected became a building block for clearer communication. What truly changed my perspective was realizing that even native speakers make mistakes. They slip up, forget words, or mispronounce things too. The difference is that they do not let mistakes stop them. They laugh, correct themselves, and continue speaking. If they could do that, why couldn't I? Instead of hiding from errors, I began to welcome them. Every mistake was proof that I was practicing. Every slip of the tongue was a step closer to fluency. Looking back now, I can see that mistakes were never failures. They were teachers disguised as small stumbles. Without them, I would still be stuck in silence, afraid to use the language. By making mistakes, I moved forward. By accepting them, I built confidence. The truth is simple. The more mistakes you make, the faster you improve. Each one carries a lesson that no textbook can give. Each one pushes you closer to real communication. Today, I no longer fear mistakes. I see them as friends that walk beside me on this journey. They remind me that learning a language is not about perfection, but about progress. And every time I catch myself saying something wrong, I smile because I know that another lesson is waiting for me. At the beginning of my English journey, I believed that long study sessions were the key to progress. I thought spending hours at a desk once a week would surely help me master grammar rules and memorize long lists of words. After one of those long sessions, I often felt drained but proud of my effort. A few days later, however, I noticed most of the knowledge had already slipped away. That cycle repeated itself many times, leaving me disappointed and convinced that perhaps I was not talented enough for languages. The truth revealed itself slowly through experience. Consistency turned out to be far more powerful than intensity. Practicing for only 20 minutes a day seemed almost too simple to make a difference, yet I decided to test it. Instead of waiting for large chunks of free time that rarely came, I carved out small moments each day. Those short sessions felt manageable, and to my surprise, they quickly became habits. Each morning I added English to my routine by reading something small. It could be a short article, a page of a novel, or even a few posts online. At first, I stumbled through unfamiliar words, but with daily repetition, patterns started to appear. My eyes grew familiar with common phrases, and I no longer had to pause to translate. That daily practice taught me that language reveals itself slowly, like a picture sharpening over time. Listening became another cornerstone of my routine. At first, native voices in podcasts and videos seemed too fast, like a blur of sounds. I often caught only one or two words in an entire sentence. Instead of giving up, I kept listening in short bursts. Some days I played an audio clip while walking. Other days I watched a short video with subtitles. Over time, the noise began to separate into recognizable words. Phrases that once confused me started to feel familiar. I realized that my ears needed daily training just like muscles need exercise. Speaking was perhaps the most intimidating part of my practice. Fear of mistakes often silenced me, but I knew progress required action. I began talking to myself in English, describing simple things like the weather or my plans for the day. Later, I joined short online exchanges with strangers who were also learning. At first, my words came out slowly and unevenly, but day by day, my voice grew stronger. The act of speaking daily built confidence more effectively than any grammar exercise ever did. Writing rounded out my practice. I started with a simple diary, recording a few sentences about my day. Over time, those sentences became longer, and I grew more comfortable expressing my thoughts. Writing allowed me to pause, reflect, and carefully choose words. It also revealed areas of grammar I needed to strengthen. Unlike speaking, where mistakes disappeared quickly, writing gave me a record I could revisit and learn from. Daily habits transformed my view of English. The language no longer felt like a subject locked inside textbooks. Instead, it became part of my everyday life. Reading a short piece in the morning, listening to a podcast on the way to the market, writing a few lines before bed, or practicing a small conversation online, all of these moments combined into steady growth. The power of consistency taught me that improvement is not about dramatic effort once in a while. It is about gentle, repeated steps taken every day. 5 hours of intense study once a week may look impressive, but 20 minutes daily quietly builds a stronger foundation. Each small session added to the last like drops filling a cup. One day I looked back and realized the cup was no longer empty. English became less of a task and more of a companion in my daily routine. By reading, listening, speaking, and writing a little every day, I discovered that fluency is not built in sudden leaps but in steady steps. Those habits, once small and fragile, grew into the structure that supports my learning today. At the start of my English journey, I often carried my native language into every thought. I would listen, translate in my head, then try to respond. It felt like running a race with heavy shoes. Each sentence passed through two filters, slowing me down and making conversations awkward. By the time I formed a reply, the moment had already moved on. That habit of translating seemed natural in the beginning, but it quickly became a trap. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting near a window watching the sky, and the sentence "It is sunny today" appeared in my mind. For the first time, I had not translated from my native tongue. The thought arrived in English, simple yet complete. That small moment gave me hope. If one sentence could appear naturally, maybe more would follow. From then on, I began training my mind to think in English. First, I kept it simple. I described the world around me in short phrases. I want food. The street is quiet. My friend is late. These small sentences seemed unimportant, but they acted as stepping stones. They allowed me to practice without pressure, even in silence. Over time, the habit grew stronger. My mind began to reach for English first, and translation slowly faded into the background. This new way of thinking changed how I learned. Vocabulary was no longer just a list of words on a page. Instead, each word carried a picture, a sound, or a feeling. When I thought about the word apple, I no longer imagined my native word for it. I pictured the fruit itself, red and shiny, and the English word came naturally. This direct connection between word and image gave me a sense of freedom. I was no longer chained to translation. The process was not easy. Many times I caught myself slipping back into old habits. In conversations especially, my brain wanted to translate every sentence before speaking. I had to remind myself to relax, to accept mistakes, and to trust that my meaning would still come across. Slowly, those moments of hesitation grew shorter. English thoughts began to appear like sparks, bright and unplanned. Daily practice helped more than anything. Walking to the store, I described what I saw in English. Waiting for the bus, I rehearsed what I wanted to say if someone asked me a question. Lying in bed at night, I replayed my day in simple sentences. At first, the phrases were basic, almost childlike, but I knew that simplicity was the foundation. As my vocabulary expanded, so did my inner voice. Sentences grew longer, more detailed, and more expressive. Thinking in English also made listening easier. Before, I would hear a native speaker, translate the words in my head, and then struggle to keep up. Once I started thinking in English, the process became smoother. Words entered my mind and stayed there without detours. Understanding became more natural, and conversations no longer felt like a battle against time. In the early stages of learning English, I treated it like a serious obligation. Every lesson felt heavy, every exercise like a test. I sat with grammar books, memorized vocabulary lists, and forced myself to practice, yet something was missing. Progress felt slow, and my motivation often faded. I realized that no matter how much discipline I had, I could not continue if the process felt lifeless. That was when I discovered the importance of bringing fun into learning. The first step came with movies. I chose films I already loved in my native language and watched them again in English. At the beginning, I could barely follow along. The actors spoke quickly, their accents were different, and many words felt unfamiliar. But I kept going. I turned on subtitles, paused often, and listened again. Over time, I started recognizing common expressions. I noticed how characters used casual phrases that never appeared in textbooks. The experience felt less like study and more like entertainment, yet I was learning faster than before. Music soon became another tool. I had always loved listening to songs, so I began exploring English lyrics. Instead of simply enjoying the melody, I printed out the words and followed along. Sometimes I misunderstood at first, but eventually I caught the rhythm of the language. Singing along helped me practice pronunciation without feeling embarrassed. Music gave me a way to connect emotionally with English, as if each song carried a small story for me to uncover. Games added another layer of excitement. I enjoyed online games where players from around the world gathered, and English was the common language. At first, I typed short and simple sentences, just enough to communicate with teammates. Slowly, I grew braver, sending longer messages, asking questions, and even joking with others. Unlike a classroom, there was no pressure. The game itself made me forget my fear of mistakes. I was simply focused on the fun, and in that space, English became a natural part of my actions. Following topics I cared about also transformed my learning. I started watching English videos about hobbies I enjoyed. Cooking, travel, technology, and personal growth all became doorways into the language. Because I was genuinely interested, I paid closer attention and remembered details more easily. I subscribed to podcasts, read short articles, and joined online groups where people shared ideas about those same interests. Each interaction felt less like a lesson and more like joining a global conversation. The more I added these enjoyable activities, the more my mindset shifted. English stopped being only about rules and tests. It became part of the things I already loved. Instead of forcing myself to study, I looked forward to spending time with the language. Even on days when I felt tired, I could still relax with a movie, hum along to a song, or read a post about something I liked. Without realizing it, I was practicing consistently, and consistency was the key to real improvement. Looking back, I see how much joy changed my progress. By mixing entertainment with study, I stayed motivated and curious. Movies taught me natural dialogue. Music sharpened my listening and pronunciation. Games gave me confidence in communication. Following my interests built my vocabulary in a way that felt personal. Each fun activity became a stepping stone, leading me further without the weight of boredom. Now English feels less like a subject and more like a companion in my daily life. I can enjoy a film, sing a song, or join a conversation with friends across the world, all through this language that once felt distant. Making it fun turned the journey from a chore into an adventure. And that simple shift, I believe, is what keeps me moving forward every day. I believed that success meant reaching perfection. I thought I had to speak flawlessly, write without errors, and understand every word I heard. That belief became a heavy weight on my shoulders. Each time I made a mistake, I felt discouraged. Each time I hesitated, I wondered if I was failing. But as I continued learning, I discovered that perfection was never the real goal. The truth is, perfection is impossible. What matters is progress, practice, and the courage to keep moving forward even when things are not perfect. Daily practice slowly changed everything for me. It did not matter if I only had a few minutes to read an article or listen to a podcast. Those small, regular moments built a strong foundation. Like drops of water filling a jar, every short practice session added up over time. I no longer judged myself by how quickly I could become fluent. Instead, I focused on showing up each day. The consistency gave me confidence and showed me that even little steps lead to great progress. I also learned to see mistakes differently. At first, they embarrassed me. I avoided speaking because I did not want to be judged. But I realized that mistakes are not signs of failure. They are signs of growth. Each wrong word taught me the right one. Each misunderstanding pushed me to listen more carefully. With every small error, I became stronger. The fear of being wrong began to fade, replaced by a quiet courage. It took time, but little by little, I stopped hiding and started speaking with more confidence. Patience became another lesson. In a world where everything moves quickly, it is tempting to want instant results. But language learning does not happen overnight. It is like planting a tree. You water it, you give it sunlight, and you wait. Some days it feels like nothing is happening, but beneath the surface, roots are growing. That invisible progress prepares the way for visible success. Accepting the slow pace of growth allowed me to stay calm and keep going, even during moments of frustration. Perhaps the most important discovery was the power of joy. Learning English does not have to be a constant struggle. The more I found ways to enjoy the process, the easier it became. Watching a movie, singing along to a favorite song, or chatting with friends made the language feel alive. I stopped seeing English as a school subject and started experiencing it as a living part of my life. Joy turned effort into adventure. Through these lessons, I began to understand what English really is. It is not a set of rules written in books. It is not only exams or exercises. It is a language people use every day to share ideas, tell stories, and connect across cultures. Every time I spoke with someone from another country, I felt the truth of this connection. English was the bridge that allowed me to cross into new friendships, new opportunities, and new perspectives. Today, I no longer chase perfection. Instead, I carry with me 4 guiding principles. Practice daily, embrace mistakes, stay patient, and enjoy the journey. These simple habits have given me more progress than any obsession with flawless grammar ever did. I see now that success in English is not about reaching an endpoint. It is about building a relationship with the language, one that grows stronger with time. And my story with English continues. And I know there will always be challenges ahead. But I also know I have the tools to face them. Perfection is not necessary. What matters is showing up each day, daring to try, and allowing the language to become a natural part of my life. With courage, patience, and joy, English is no longer just something I study. It is a living bridge that connects me to the world.